And I'm a member of the YPO Monaco chapter. I'd like to welcome you to Geopolitical Implications of Coronavirus, YPO briefing with Ian Bremmer, President of Eurasia Group and G0 Media. This presentation will last approximately 1 hour, and there will be a question and answer session at the end of the call. If you have any questions for our speaker, please submit them at any time via the Q&A feature on your Zoom screen, and we will get to them during the Q&A session. Please note that this call is being recorded, and the recording link will be available approximately 48 hours after the live call. YPO is a platform for idea exchange in a safe haven of trust among peers. YPO acknowledges diverse perspectives around any topic and does not advocate for or against any position. The views and opinions expressed in this global conference call are solely of the resources presenting them, and YPO does not endorse or oppose the perspectives expressed. Members will have the opportunity to provide alternative perspectives either during this call or in successive calls. Now, I'd like to make a brief introduction for Ian. Ian is a world-renowned political scientist and expert on globalization. He is also a YPO Global Award winner, having been the resource for the 2018-2019 YPO Global Best Business event. He's president and founder of Eurasia Group, the world's leading political risk research and consulting firm, and G0 Media, a company dedicated to providing intelligent and engaging coverage of international affairs. It is interesting to note that his clear-headed insights are not only offered through speeches and written commentary, but even with satirical puppets. He's the host of G0 World with Ian Bremmer, which airs weekly on US national public television and is a frequent guest on all the major news channels. A prolific writer, Ian is the author of 10 books, including the New York Times bestseller, Us versus Them, The Failure of Globalism, which examines the rise of populism across the world. He also serves as the foreign affairs columnist and editor at large for Time magazine. Currently teaches at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, and previously was a professor at New York University. So without further ado, it is now my pleasure to turn the call over to Ian.
Thank you very much, Tassos. Good to be with all of you. I certainly feel like we could have a shot at best event under quarantine, right? I mean, you're definitely gonna need to have that going forward. It's a whole new sense of how we conduct business out there. The geopolitical implications are, in some ways the most underappreciated. They're certainly going to be the most impactful. Maybe I'm going to start this with something pretty dramatic. The global order is going to change on the back of this crisis, right? This is the first crisis of our lifetimes that has not happened in an America-led world. It is what I call a G0 world. It's an absence of global leadership. The Americans don't want to be the world policeman or the architect of global trade, or even the cheerleader for global values. And no other country or group of countries are capable or willing to replace the Americans. Now, if you put this in context of the most recent serious global crises that we've experienced, you're looking at 9/11 and you're looking at the financial crisis. 9/11, the Americans rallied around the flag, huge support for President Bush on the back of that. The transatlantic relationship, the most important alliance in the world, came together strongly to support the US in the war against Al-Qaeda and in Afghanistan. And even the Russians, who were an adversary of the US even at that time, nonetheless made an offer to the US, which we took them up on, to use bases in Central Asian states to help with logistics of what otherwise would have been a much more challenging war to conduct. 2008, very strong rally around the flag effect in the United States, both around Bush and around Obama. Very strong transatlantic relationship coordinating fiscal stimulus, monetary policy. And of course, the Americans created the G20 because of the 2008 financial crisis. And the most effective meeting ever held, the most effective summit, was in April 2009 in London, where the Americans were leading and all the other countries were supporting American leadership, including even the Chinese, to try to ensure that we avoided a global depression and came out of the financial crisis strongly. 2020 is not that. It's very clear. Trump right now has his best ratings actually since he was inaugurated at 46%. So in other words, Bush at 92% after 9/11 was double. He is the most divisive president in modern times, whether you voted for him or you voted against him. And it also comes, this crisis, in the heat of an election period. Obviously, those are unfortunate coincidences. The transatlantic relationship is much weaker. The Americans shutting down trade, travel from Europe last week in a press conference, didn't talk to the Europeans in advance, and only permanent residents and citizens were allowed to travel after that announcement. The next morning, the European Union condemned the Trump administration for making that decision. Can you imagine in 2008, 2009, or after 9/11, if the Europeans had condemned the Americans for the decisions they were making? It's inconceivable. And perhaps most importantly, the Chinese and the Russians are engaged in active propaganda, fake news, and working to undermine the American narrative of what's happening. They are certainly fighting, seeing this as an advantage for themselves, in playing a more significant role in the global order. The Russians using this period to launch a price war on oil against American allies, the Saudis, and of course against frackers in the US. The Chinese kicking American journalists from the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, not only out of mainland China, but also out of Hong Kong and Macau, which breaks the basic law of those territories. Obviously, that'll lead to more confrontation going forward. So, I mean, the long and the short of it, I mean, this is not only a global crisis, it's the most significant global crisis of our lives. The economic impact, irrespective of the lack of geopolitical coordination, is far more dramatic. We're looking at a minimum of 15% unemployment in the United States by end of second quarter. That's considerably higher than what we saw 2008, 2009. You have to go back to the Great Depression to see numbers that exceed that in the United States. Similar, what we'll be experiencing in Europe, and of course in the developing world, it'll be worse than that. We'll talk about that. And on top of that, a global crisis hitting every country in the world. Only Burundi in Africa wasn't showing tests when I looked on Monday, any cases. And that's because Burundi hadn't actually had any tests. It's hard to have cases when you don't have tests. I suppose that's one way to avoid coronavirus as a crisis, not an effective one, but it's affecting everyone around the world. You would think that if there was ever a time that you would need a global and united response in terms of a vaccine development, in terms of sharing data so we understand the parameters of the virus, in terms of economic response, in terms of shutdown, lockdown, and restarting economies, this is when you would need that coordination. That coordination is absent. So that's the backdrop. That's 5 minutes for you of what is the context, the geopolitical context of this crisis. So what's happening geopolitically right now, and what are we likely to see going forward? Maybe I'll start with the changes in the global order that we should expect, and then I can dig in a little more micro. I think there are a few things that are pretty clear geopolitically that are coming on the back of this crisis. The first is that we are going to see an unwind of globalization that was already starting to a degree. We wrote about it in our top risks back in January that a lot of you probably saw, where on the technology side, the US and China were entering into a technology cold war around Huawei, ZTE, the fight for 5G, big data, AI, the cloud, surveillance technology, supercomputing. in all of those areas, American firms were not investing into China. The Chinese didn't allow it. The Chinese were not investing in the United States. The US was sanctioning. And furthermore, the Americans were telling American allies, do not use Chinese firms for technology, for high technology in this area, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully. But that was, I mean, if you think about what that means, breaking big data and surveillance and filtering into two, something that we had considered to be the World Wide Web, that's a very big move away from globalization. And it hits efficiency, it hits growth, it means a lower quality of the economic environment going forward. We were already there. But on the back of this crisis, you are now going to see deglobalization expand into manufacturing and services, deeper and broader across the global economy. There's lots of reasons for that. First, a just-in-time supply chain is incredibly efficient. It's great for growth. But when you shut down the world for a few months, suddenly you realize it doesn't have a lot of resilience. And in the context of that, a lot of companies are going to switch towards a just-in-case supply chain. They'll create more resilience. They'll do more stockpiling. They'll engage in more localization and regionalization. I mean, you know, if I look at our 900,000 clients around the world, almost every major CEO I was talking to with a global footprint in the last year was telling me that they had the ability to make more money in the next 5 to 10 years with fewer people. And specifically, they were looking at a lot of their exposure in emerging markets, and specifically China, where labor costs were going up, the competitive environment was getting more challenging, there was an absence of rule of law, there's an absence of independent judiciary. But because the companies were doing well, and because most of these CEOs are not as long-lasting as YPO CEOs, we're talking about, you know, sort of big publicly traded MNCs, they only last 4 or 5 years. They don't have as long a term of time frame. And so they weren't looking to make really difficult decisions if they didn't have to. And they certainly didn't want to upset the Chinese. But they were moving in that direction. And my expectation was, well, when we see the next big recession, that's when we're going to see an unwind. Well, not only do we now see a big recession, but we see the Chinese as responsible for the initial outbreak and covering it up. We see travel ban on Westerners coming in and others because they're not handling coronavirus as well now as the Chinese are. And we'll also see a move towards patriotic companies, those that are nationalized in the West, and also those that receive support and stimulus in the next round from the United States government, saying, well, if you want this cash, you're going to have to hire Americans. So for all those reasons, we're going to see much more of an unwind, which means, you know, number one, the biggest trend, if you think about over the last 30 years, what's the positive? When people have been saying that things are going great, Bill Gates, Steve Pinker, all these people, you know, they basically are saying things that are first and second order consequences of globalization. Lifespan is increasing. Healthcare is improving. Quality of education is increasing. Women are getting educated and they're getting into the workplace. People are getting immunized. All these things. These are all benefits from borders becoming more porous and people and ideas and goods and services moving faster and faster around the world. Now, we know that globalization has also created people that are disaffected and dislocated, that the redistribution of cash and benefits, particularly for the working and middle classes in the developed world, has been inadequate, creating a wave of populism and nationalism that has led to anti-establishment sentiment, opposing open borders, opposing free trade, even opposing America and its allies, providing security outside their own countries. But nonetheless, globalization was still driving forward fairly relentlessly, faster and faster as the Chinese and the emerging markets open up in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and faster in 1988 and 1991, the wall comes down, the Soviet Union collapses. But now, when we're looking at 2020, we are talking about a profound change in trajectory of globalization that obviously will have serious, more negative knock-on consequences in the quality of the global economy. On top of that, you have the fact that China will very soon be the largest economy in the world. In fact, sooner than people had expected, because the Chinese economy will be flat to 2-3% growth this year, while the American economy will contract significantly. And you know, in that context, the Chinese economy, which is poor, so middle income, it's non-transparent, it's authoritarian, it's state capitalist. I mean, obviously, a world where the Chinese are doing much more governance and demand much more conditionality for the money and the services that they offer is going to create fewer public goods, lower quality governance, and lower quality economic growth. I mean, that's not to cast aspersions at the Chinese. It's just a reality. I mean, we've never lived in a world before where the largest economy wasn't an advanced industrial economy. And whether you're talking about climate change and you know, the quality of emissions that both come out of China as well as are exported through Belt and Road, or whether you're talking about the likelihood of massive pandemics. I mean, when SARS hit, China was 3%, 4% of the global economy. Today, it's 17%. The implications of that are obvious, right? In terms of the quality of growth and the likelihood of much greater risk. So all of this will lead to a change in trajectory in globalization that will affect us for a generation or more. That's one change in the global order that we will expect on the back of this. A second change in the global order will be an increase in influence of China globally. And this is not really something I think that's open to a lot of pushback. You know, if I think about how the Americans are responding to this crisis, and I'll cover this in more depth in a bit, but, you know, on the healthcare system, very late, on testing, very late, now paying much more attention. On fiscal and monetary side, very fast, bipartisan, very effective in getting the stuff passed. We'll see about actual implementation over the next few weeks. But on the international leadership front, the U.S. has been absent. A total of $4 million in humanitarian aid that has been earmarked on average per developing country. That's it. Hasn't actually been spent. No America-led G7 to provide coordination. No America-led G20 to provide coordination. Very limited support for the IMF and other international financial institutions asking for emergency support for developing markets. An absence of the United States, as the Americans, of course, are themselves trying to grapple with this crisis. Europeans, same situation, though not as much would have been expected from the Europeans, either individually or collectively, in this kind of a crisis. China, of course, is a very different story. Now, let us remember that the Chinese created the original sin here. And I don't mean that the virus came from Wuhan. I mean that they lied about it. I mean that when the World Health Organization wanted an understanding in mid-January of whether or not there was human-to-human transfer, the Chinese government stipulated that there was not. They knew that there was, and they knew for weeks that there was, but they told the WHO there was not, and the WHO, which gets lots of funding from the Chinese, went along with that publicly. The Chinese refused access to the American CDC to confirm the results the Chinese government was putting out, and for at least a month, maybe 5 weeks, the Chinese government was acting as if it was business as usual and allowing Chinese to travel from Wuhan as they normally would, 5 million plus Chinese across the country and around the world, leading to the explosion of outbreak in China, and also the initial outbreaks in Iran, Italy, Washington State, and others. So clearly they're responsible for the initial outbreak. And this is not to say that the Americans did not then mishandle it desperately afterwards, the Europeans and others. I'm simply talking about where it started. And it's important to start there because, of course, after the Chinese government realized they had a big problem on their hands and they had a whistleblower and people were talking about it and it wasn't getting contained and they couldn't cover it up, then they take it very seriously. And of course, they've got a technologically empowered surveillance state. They've got the ability to ensure compliance among citizens across all of their urban areas, and they shut everything down. 80 million under complete lockdown, very different than the lockdowns we're talking about in the US and Europe and emerging markets right now. Extraordinary response. The world's never seen it before. And as they start allowing people to move around again. This is not a restart of the full economy. This is massive micromanagement of social distancing in workplaces, every workplace, in restaurants, every restaurant, in food deliveries, every food delivery, taxi cabs, sanitation 3 times a day, ensuring full plastic dividers that are airproof between passengers and drivers. The sort of thing, I mean, it's a little frightening that you can do this to a society this large, but it's also humbling in their ability to crack down. Now, the Chinese have lied still about the number of cases on the ground, and there have been recent outbreaks they are not making public. And it's clear from the fact that they've opened hospitals, they've opened movie theaters and then closed them down. They've opened practice for professional sports and closed it down. They've opened tourist facilities and closed them down. I can keep on going. But we're not talking about massive uncontrolled outbreak. And from what we're watching, our China practice right now in terms of traffic patterns, satellite imagery, as well as the conversations we're having with CEOs that are doing business with supply chain inside China. They are right now, their supply chain is probably about 70% back to normal in terms of ability to function, people on the job, ability to produce. The demand is not there. That's a different story, either globally or inside China. There is stimulus. It's nowhere close to what you're seeing in the US. And they should be at 100% supply chain capacity by May. Sort of mid-May, we feel pretty confident about that. So that's what you're seeing in terms of China internally. Externally, they've cut off all but completely essential transit, 14-day government-mandated surveillance of those that are traveling in. So the borders are not in any way porous, they're controlled. And they're also providing a significant amount of humanitarian aid, as well as medical personnel, to every EU member, to all the key IFIs, the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, all the rest. They are also engaging in a very strong public diplomacy campaign with their state media, social media, as well as a propaganda campaign, which is blaming the Americans for the failings of their system. The sort of thing we have not historically seen from China, we've seen from Russia. Because these countries, now, by the way, some of the aid they've provided was faulty. Some of the test kits didn't work to Spain. Some of the masks didn't work to the Netherlands. They've been sent back. Within a week, the Chinese changed the licensing for allowing companies to export any healthcare equipment. So they probably will be able to get a handle on that. But even given that, the level of appreciation for these governments who are desperate and need the support and are now getting it from China and nowhere else is very significant. So the soft power we will see from China and the influence they'll have politically over a bunch of countries around the world they did not have before, including allies of the United States, will be a dramatically different order from what we've seen going into this crisis. I'd also point out the IMF. I was talking to Madame Georgieva, the head of the IMF, a couple days ago. She told me that 3 weeks ago, she had put together a $50 billion emergency facility for countries to request aid from the IMF, developing countries, in response to coronavirus. She expected that by this weekend, 3 to 5 countries would avail themselves of that facility. As of this weekend, 81 countries had requested that aid. She'd never seen anything like that remotely in her lifetime. She expects it to hit over 100 this week. I haven't talked with her in the last few days, so I don't know if it has, but I'm sure it has. I expect it has. She's asked it for another $50 billion, and she's gotten it. But that doesn't mean that she's going to get another 400 billion, which is what she needs. And she doesn't want to make a request that isn't that fails, because obviously then it looks like the IMF isn't doing its job. So it's very careful orchestration. And I'm hearing the same thing from the World Bank, from the UN, from the WHO, from other organizations around the world. Now, when the money really is necessary, when you need the same 10% bailout that you're getting in the US right now in emerging markets, and they're only able to pay 1% in their own stimulus and bailout, say in India right now or other countries around the world, and the IMF has $1 trillion, but they need 4. And the countries, I mean, the Americans and the Europeans are like, we're busy and we don't want to give you money. We need to focus on the US, America first. Well, the Chinese will give money. They will not give anywhere near what's necessary, but they'll give it. And when they do, they are going to demand conditionality. And that conditionality is going to mean things like changing loan requirements so it doesn't align countries more with free markets or with liberal democracies. It means changing in the voting patterns and the voting quotas of the IMF. It means changing in the decision-making around who gets to determine high-level personnel. So here in the architecture of the global order, we're going to see a very different orientation coming out of this crisis because of China. That's another change we're going to see. Now, the one change I'm not sure we're going to see, but might happen, is an actual Cold War between the Americans and the Chinese. You've probably seen that many in the Trump administration are now referring to the virus as the Wuhan virus. Trump called it the China virus for a couple weeks, then stopped after he had a phone call with Xi Jinping. But last week, you were unable to get a letter from the G7 on any sort of forward-looking, even monitoring the situation, because Secretary of State Pompeo demanded that the G7 refer to the virus as the Wuhan virus, and no American allies were prepared to go along with him. Now, Trump has blamed the Chinese, as has Pence, as recently as yesterday, for this outbreak and for not being straightforward with the Americans. Again, I've told you what the Chinese have done. But Trump has also said that Xi Jinping's his friend. He's a good man. He's a strong leader. He didn't mean for this to blow up. It's hurting his own economy worse than it's hurting the Americans. We'll see if that's true. And in part, he's also said that the Chinese are making good on the phase 1 trade deal, which certainly is not going to be true this year, because with much lower Chinese growth, there's no way they're going to buy $200 billion of American ag. But the point is that Trump himself has been reluctant to get into a big fight with the Chinese when the American markets are already taking such a beating. He doesn't really want to further potentially talk them down. Having said that, his approval ratings right now are the highest they've been. Now, when we look forward in 2 months' time and the U.S. is still under lockdown, as I expect it will be, and in part that's because there has not been a nationwide order that has in coordinated fashion closed down the U.S. states. It's instead been very federal and decentralized, and you've got governors competing against each other for price to get medical equipment that they can secure and the rest. I think Trump is likely not to maintain a 46% approval rating. And as that happens, and as implementation of stimulus becomes more challenging, and as we look forward to the next tranche, which there certainly will be, I expect that he's likely to see a lot more personal blame for leadership that has not been as effective in response to coronavirus. And when that happens, he's going to need to blame people. And certainly he will try to blame Democrats for the lockdown, and therefore the economy is doing worse, kind of like Bolsonaro in Brazil. But ultimately, the potential that the United States turns to blame China becomes real, and that the likelihood that leads to strong patriotism in China, tit-for-tat escalation, and a broader Cold War between the two countries is quite significant. Couple more points before we open for questions. I have been very impressed with the level of economic response and the breadth of economic response in wealthy countries. 10% of U.S. GDP, bipartisan support hitting every part of the U.S. economy very quickly by Mnuchin, Secretary of Treasury, and Speaker House Pelosi. I doubt Obama and a Republican House could have done better or faster. Similarly impressed with Powell, and I've been impressed with the central bankers across the advanced industrial economies. They're not coordinated, but they are technocrats. They are independent. They've done a good job. And I think that despite this extraordinary shutdown of all but essential services in the advanced industrial world, that's sufficient to keep the economy moving and from collapsing for 3 months. But probably not more than that. Again, we're going to have to come back. What I'm not as comfortable with is the healthcare system. Italy doesn't have a great healthcare system, but Milan does. They've got far more beds per capita than most cities across Europe and the United States. And they've got good, reasonably well-trained healthcare force. it got overwhelmed to the point that in Milan, with a great mayor, good solid governance and infrastructure, had to turn away a majority of people that needed critical ICU care for coronavirus, never mind anything else. And when that happens, when your healthcare system breaks, you have about 5 to 10 times the level of mortality from coronavirus than you have when the healthcare system works. It is not clear to me right now if New York City, where I'm sitting, is going to have a sole kind of healthcare response, or a New York healthcare or Milan healthcare response. We don't know. On the upside, we've got a very capable bureaucracy that has a lot of money and international connections and will be able to get to the front of the line and source a lot more material and equipment. Having said that, we're talking about minimum an explosion of cases per day of 5x where we are right now. And that's happening over the course of a 2 to 3 week period where a lot of people that were sick will still need those ventilators. They're not dying immediately, and they're not getting better immediately. So the potential of the US healthcare system in New York getting overwhelmed, I think, is close to a coin flip right now, though I'm a little bit more optimistic today than I was a few days ago. Having said that, I think it is likely that second-tier cities that don't have those benefits and also weren't doing the social distancing, second-tier cities in places like Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Southern Florida, New Orleans, right? Maybe even LA and Detroit look more likely to get overwhelmed. If that happens, the lockdown has to go longer, and that happens, the fatalities we see attached to coronavirus goes much higher. The 100,000 to 240,000 deaths expected in Fauci's models that he discussed at the beginning of this week, and so shocked Americans who have never experienced anything remotely like that on their soil, did imply full lockdown and social distancing with compliance by Friday by the entire country, and the healthcare system's not getting overwhelmed. On the former, we're probably at about 80 to 90% right now. We'll see if it holds in terms of compliance over the coming 2 to 4 weeks. On the healthcare systems, as I just said, we're not where he wants us to be, which implies, at the very least, you're pushing on the higher end of that level of fatality as we get through May, June. And again, my expectation is that you don't see a restart in the US economy and the beginning of the end of lockdown until probably end of May, beginning of June at this point. That's what it probably looks like. The implications for emerging markets are vastly more challenging. In some cases, very young populations, high incidence of existing disease, don't get tests. On the one hand, they can tolerate the healthcare system collapsing and they can tolerate higher numbers of deaths. On the other hand, the ability of the willingness of developed countries to allow people to travel to those countries in that environment will be zero. So it'll be harder to get that supply chain back up and running. It'll also be harder to get commerce and business as usual, travel as usual, those places. There you're not talking about third, fourth quarter, you're talking about next year. And that could be a lot of emerging markets. That could be Brazil, that could be India, that could be Russia, that could be a lot of places. So again, I think this is something we're monitoring very closely. Before we turn to questions, I will tell all of you, if you're not seeing our updates or our daily coronavirus, materials or conference calls, and you want to, certainly the guys organizing the call can help you with that. I know they've sent out some of that material. And my own email, Bremmer with 2 M's at eurasiagroup.net. You can drop me a note. Also, I recognize how many people are on this call. If there are questions that you want to follow up with me personally, feel free to drop me a note, and I'll do my damnedest if we couldn't get them answered in the remaining 25 minutes here. But I did want to leave a lot of time for questions. Again, I recognize, just how many interesting views we have on this call. So I'd love to hear from all of you.
Thank you, Ian, for sharing your insights and expertise with us. Thank you all and have a great day. And thank you, Ian.
Yes.